So, hello. I'm excited to have with us today Ethan Novek, a multiple award winning chemist and the sole inventor of 25 granted utility patents with over 150 patent filings in the materials, science, and sustainable energy industries. Ethan has invented 9 new platform technologies in heat transfer, electricity storage, gas separation, refrigeration cycles, calcium oxide and cement production, tidal power, power generation, and CO2 conversion. He is also the inventor, founder, and CEO of SolvCor Technologies. Um, Super excited to have you today. That was the longest introduction I think we've done so far that has so many things to unpack. We're not going to talk about, sadly, 150 patent filings and 25 granted utility patents. So tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about SolvCor.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Jason. I'm very happy to be here, and this is my first time in the Canon, so I'm actually it's very impressive, and it's great to see so many people in the ecosystem here. It definitely feels pre-pandemic. There's a lot. I mean, to park here, you got to really go out. I mean, there's a lot of cars, a lot of people, a lot of activity. So exciting to see the Houston ecosystem being active, even outside of just the clean energy industry. In terms of I'm Ethan Novek. I'm the founder of SolvCor, also the inventor of SolvCor. I moved to Houston about a year ago from Princeton, New Jersey, and in terms of SolvCor and the company itself and our technology, I would start with saying how does the world change, or should we say how do people change, or what will people need as the world gets warmer? They will need more cooling, right? And ultimately, how is cooling done today? And cooling is done today by mostly using water. So water, especially in large scale cooling processes, water is ultimately the heat transfer medium that's used to cool. And so if you look at how a cooling process works today, and in terms of cooling processes, the applications are really everything that people see or take for granted that's very important in society. So things like data centers, every person knows that the internet is grown dramatically over especially the last 10 years. And as a result, hyperscale data centers and the data centers that kind of back the internet and the cloud are ultimately growing exponentially as well. And they've grown, there's one built, every day pretty much. And these hyperscale data centers, along with every commercial building, pretty much every industrial process, many of the large residential high rises, or every skyscraper you see in Houston or New York or any of the major cities, they're based around water as the heat transfer medium for cooling. And the basic principle of using water as a cooling medium involves heating up water in the process of cooling, let's say, the air. And then ultimately, when the water is warmed up, cooling down that water with something, whether that's a chiller or the outdoor air or evaporation of water. That's ultimately the basic principle of it. And so all of the world's cooling infrastructure, pretty much all the world's cooling infrastructure, is built around the properties of water. And that's because water ultimately is, as of before SolvCor, the best heat transfer liquid, the best medium, ultimately because it has had the highest specific heat capacity, and through that also the highest thermal conductivity. And so for over 100 years, since the invention of, I guess, modern day cooling, water has been this cooling medium. And ultimately, what SolvCor does and what SolvCor accomplishes is it makes water act like almost 2 times water, ultimately almost doubling the specific heat of water. And the implications of that are quite extensive. The most immediate and potentially obvious of those implications is the ability to reduce the flow rate of water while acting in the same fashion, transferring the same amount of heat, the same amount of load. And so to give an example, we can reduce the flow rate of water by 46% while achieving the same total cooling, the same total heat transfer with SolvCor liquids. So SolvCor liquids are third-party validated to have a specific heat about 1.8 times greater than water, so almost 2 times. And so that's just one example. And lowering the flow rate by 46% means an increase in pumping or reduction in pumping energy consumption by about 82%, just based on general flow characteristics of water and other liquids. And so that's just a tremendous energy efficiency gain. But then it goes well beyond that too. I mean, you look at the broader picture of it, it goes into the fact that you can improve the performance of cooling processes. So high performance computing and chemical processes, increasing the throughput and output of chemicals. Its implications are much broader than that. And then even kind of longer term, short term is we're looking at simply installing this in typical cooling systems already in chilled water systems. We don't have to change the equipment or how these systems operate, yet we improve the efficiency or reduce the sizing or one of the two. But in terms of longer term, SolvCor also has the potential to change the way that we do refrigeration itself as well. And so there's a huge potential implication, not only in energy efficiency and reducing equipment sizing, but also in the ability to reduce the use of greenhouse gas refrigerants.
And so one of the things I heard was you've increased the specific energy of the water. Does that necessarily mean you've increased the conductivity? And I know there's a couple question there, so I'll let you. Take it away.
Very good question. I like the technical questions. So in the case of SolvCor, yes, and there's a few reasons why. So the core principle of SolvCor, one, we're enhancing the specific heat so much. It's not just like a minor. It's 80-something% increase in specific heat. The second part of it is the viscosity stays quite low. And so that still enables you to have those properties of water, especially low viscosity.
And viscosity, let's explain, that's the gooiness of water.
It's gooiness of water, exactly. Or the lack thereof, right? It's not, water isn't very gooey relative to some other things. Yeah. And then the third aspect of it as well is that there's this convective heat transfer property. So when the way SolvCor's underlying mechanism works and the ultimate discovery of SolvCor, where it came from, I can tell you a little bit about that if you're interested, but it's this liquid that turns into two liquid phases upon heating or cooling. And so ultimately what happens is it pulls convective, ultimately it moves this liquid layer, this new liquid that forms, new liquid phase, kind of moves off the surface, forms and moves off the surface of whatever, let's say, heat exchanger you're dealing with. And so that ultimately increases the effective thermal conductivity of the liquid, as well as the intrinsic property of the liquid itself having a higher specific heat.
Got it. This brings me back 10, 15 years to mechanical engineering class when we talk about boundary layers and boundary layer formation, and you have to draw a little resistor network to like calculate out the heat transfer. And so there's both more storage of heat, but you're really fundamentally changing the mechanism that allows the heat to transfer, and that allows you to kind of have these efficiencies and improvements throughout the entire system. And I think that's like real technology there. Like you develop, this is taking a fundamental physical change that you're seeing in the world. You've found a way to control it with the chemistry, and that gives us real world benefit. And you're right, in a world where we got to control the heat more and better. And I think that it touches things that are legacy. Like the first thing I think of when I think of heat control is my car engine. How do I keep that cool? But that even touches like newer vehicles, right? EVs, like a big question is thermal management. How do you deal with this? How do you do it while keeping things small and efficient? And the parasitic losses on the thermal management system is a large driver of range nowadays.
Absolutely.
Right. And so this really touches everything from legacy to even new technology. And I appreciate how broad it's going to be.
I appreciate it as a Houstonian. And so I'm going to say, first of all, welcome. Like, we're happy to have you here, and all of your patents and the additional patents that I'm sure will come. Also, because you may not know this, Houston, our motto at one point in time was actually Houston, it's hot. Because it is hot, and it is no longer our motto because it is hot and it's getting hotter. And so this is absolutely something that we should be thinking about, but we take it for granted so much. How heat impacts our daily lives and all of the technology that we use. And then from a global climate perspective, when we talk about technology, water is very important, but it's often siloed. And so there's water, and then there's energy, and there's climate tech, and like water doesn't often get thought about, even though it is, I mean, most of the planet is water, most of our bodies are water, that there's a whole effort about why do we look at technology from a certain perspective. So I love this idea. I tell me about, because I haven't been in a chemistry class in a very long time. What happens to the liquids once you use them, right?
Oh, great question. Yeah, and the good news is they stay in the system. This is a one-time. It's in the system. And these are just to think about how these cooling systems operate. There's a closed loop that ultimately that SolvCor goes into, and the closed loop is how most of these cooling systems operate today, where ultimately water is heated up and then cooled down continuously in a closed loop.
Mhm.
So there's nothing really being added or removed, which is great. So in the end, you add SolvCor, it enhances, ultimately you make the liquid SolvCor, it enhances the effective heat capacity to almost 2 times, and then you leave it in the system. It sits in that loop. So it's not being decomposed.
There's not a byproduct.
There's no
There's not
byproduct.
a, okay.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
just enhancing an intrinsic property, significantly enhancing an intrinsic
Mhm.
property of the liquid, and so ultimately it's kind of the best situation in terms of, if you think of it from an energy efficiency benefit, you're not changing the way the system works. You're simply improving a very important part of how that system works. Something that people didn't realize you could improve. We are able to not only improve, but kind of revolutionize the whole way cooling is done because of the sizing and the efficiency gains you can get from SolvCor.
Yeah.
So
And so I think the way we would describe it is like it's non-consumable, it's stable. You could put this in there and it'll last for years.
Exactly.
And that's how fundamental it is. So
Mhm.
you were going to say something.
I was gonna say, how did you come up with this idea? Like you said, people don't think you can improve water. I wouldn't have come up with that, but you did. So how did you start this business?
Yeah, really great question too. In terms of, I think part of how I discovered it and why I discovered it was because of a completely different angle that led to the discovery of it. So I was working on a CO2 capture system. I was developing a CO2 capture system. I had made a discovery, separate invention, related to adding certain chemicals, certain solvents to a CO2 capture solution with CO2 dissolved in it, and ultimately doing that to reduce, what I discovered was I could reduce the temperature which the CO2 could come out. And of course, when you add something in a cycle, you got to remove something. And so I had to remove that solvent from the solution after we got the CO2 out. And so initially it was distillation, and then I was developing chemicals which don't require distillation, ultimately trying to get it out of a solution as a liquid at a liquid phase. And through the process of developing these chemicals, some of the chemicals I was developing would actually significantly cool the solution when I necessarily wouldn't have expected it. And it actually was a benefit to CO2 capture, which was good, but I began to realize that this had much broader implications, given this was always at a liquid phase, much broader implications than just CO2 capture. Clearly CO2 capture this benefited, but in just general heat transfer, in general cooling, in general heating, which is really everything we touch, everything we do, this could have much broader implications. And so that's what led to the founding of SolvCor, the development of the liquids for the temperature ranges of typical cooling applications. And so just through that completely different angle, I was able to discover this.
So I want to double click here because I think sometimes you're clearly running an experiment, you're collecting data, and you saw this blip in the data, and there was a decision you made where you looked at this and you didn't just go, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to go focus on the PhD work. You actually looked at this and said, that's interesting, let's make it better, or let's see how this solves problems. Was this something that happened in a moment, or was this something that happened over time? Like, tell us about that decision you made to develop this technology.
Yeah, this kind of lends to how I do experimentation and kind of how I may lead to many of my inventions, as well as I actually get very excited when experiments don't work out the way I thought they would. So I think a lot of people in, let's say, like a PhD or academic environment, they have a hypothesis and they're almost like have bias toward trying to accomplish that. I kind of take the opposite approach in a lot of my inventing, a lot of my work. If my hypothesis comes true, in many cases, it assumes that all the prior knowledge I had was true. That's not necessarily exciting. It actually, in many cases, if the prior knowledge you had was based purely on literature, you're not necessarily really discovering anything new. And that's, I mean, you are probably, but it's not, your hypothesis is based off of information that other people may have had. What's interesting is if it doesn't work out the way your hypothesis did, and in this case, it kind of did in the sense that it did accomplish the goal of getting the CO2 to come out, but it kind of didn't in the sense that it was changing the temperature of a solution in a way that was a lot more than I guess would be expected. So it was kind of, I guess, a hybrid of achieving the hypothesis and not. But I think, at least in my case, I really tried paying attention to the things that maybe people would think are extraneous or unimportant to their hypothesis, because that's often where like the greatest discoveries are found. And so that process of just, I guess one of the ways I sometimes think about things is I'm always trying to separate what I believe from what I know on a continuous basis. Like that's I think essential to like good inventing or good decision making, is just being able to be very honest with yourself and very critical of yourself, but not critical in a way that's just negative, but critical in the sense of, how do I actually know that's true? What am I basing that off of? Is that something I have confidence in, or why should I have confidence in it? And then kind of building on that. So, and that's generally how a lot of my thinking works. And so that was part of ultimately what led me to discovery. I mean, discover a lot of other things too. I mean, even the CO2 capture discovery was similar to that in terms of being able to even if it was or wasn't the hypothesis, being able to really break down what I'm seeing and what that could mean and what the implications of that could be.
Yeah. And so I'm going to bring this back to entrepreneurship because I think this is a very important skill to have. It's very difficult to constantly challenge what you do and don't know, because it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of brain space to really ask yourself these questions. But when you're, the way I'm going to bring this back to entrepreneurship,
although it saves a lot of time and energy in the long term, right? Yeah.
Doing the right things are important.
Yes.
But I think when you're bringing a technology to market, a lot of times it is a science experiment where you have to go out and say, okay, I think I'm going to go solve a problem. I have assumptions about what people need. I have assumptions about what they will pay for. I have to go out and test that and discover what they're actually willing to write a check for. Have you found in your own commercialization approaches, how has that experience served you in terms of getting out to market?
Extremely important. I treasure every customer relationship. It is, it's actually, so my process, or the process that I've done is really, once I developed SolvCor and got third-party validation for those properties that, this works and this exists, it's real, because clearly a lot of people would question if it's real just simply because of how seemingly crazy or incredible it is in terms of its properties. After that point, the number one goal was, I knew that this was going to be important for the industry, because clearly the industry is built around water as the heat transfer medium. However, where is this most valuable? Who needs this the most? And what does it mean when it's implemented? And those are questions that I really asked myself. And that required not just interaction with customers in the industry, but really finding the leading experts, and I guess we'll call them geniuses, that knew things that I didn't know at that time, but also had an understanding of the implications of something like this, like what SolvCor would do. And so I really treasure and I really enjoy, I've learned so much from the people who are just industry experts, and maybe some of the most, like some of the things that we take for granted are also some things that or I should say people take for granted in general, but also things that are so important to the world. And I mean, it's something as simple as a heat exchanger to something as complex as a data center or some of these billion-dollar infrastructure that is just so essential to the way the world operates, and how those cooling systems operate, and where SolvCor would go, and ultimately what the customer would ultimately be looking for and how they would want to implement it. Which companies actually, like sometimes you think the first partners that you should be working with are the part, like who is the customer, right? And I think that's a question that some people will mess up for so long in their entrepreneur years, and it's a really question you want to find out as early as possible. And so in our case, I initially thought the customer may have been more of the ultimate end users, and for some cases it really is, and they are still the customer. But what you discover is that really who has the authority and capabilities to really implement and utilize the full value of SolvCor. And that seemingly is actually a slightly different group. And so it's interesting kind of seeing the full ecosystem and understanding that. And you wouldn't just be able to go on Google and find that out. In fact, you wouldn't. You really have to work with the customers, ask the right questions, understand their needs, understand where you fit in there. It's a kind of a consultative process, but also most importantly, learning from that. Because I mean, ultimately, my understanding of this industry was more from maybe a thermodynamic perspective before, and really understanding the practical perspective of the industry, who does what and why they do what, is really important. And it was critical ultimately to understanding the technology. And part of this, I do want to qualify some of this. I did know when I developed SolvCor or made that discovery initially within the CO2 capture system, that the temperature range that I was using it, or I developed it in the CO2 capture system, was too high for most of the cooling applications. And so part of what I did was actually develop liquids, and this took time, that ultimately had the same properties, but were operating at the lower temperature required for cooling. So there was some information I knew about, where the temperatures would operate. But in terms of just the practical implementation of it, the value proposition, these type of things, they were assumed, as you pointed out, but they weren't validated with the actual customers. And amazing how much you learn in that process. And one thing I did learn with SolvCor was just how much bigger the implications were than what I initially thought. I mean, I was really looking narrowly. I was looking at electric vehicles. I was looking at liquid on ship cooling. I was looking at these kind of narrower markets, and I didn't fully appreciate how pretty much everything that is at an industrial scale requires cooling, and specifically with water.
And one of the things Laura talks about a lot is how, we have a lot of technology being developed here in Texas, and a lot of research that's siloed in even industry. How do we bring that out? I don't know if you want to delve into it.
Well, I have so many questions about this. My first question, if you have 150 patents filings, like, is this your favorite? Is SolvCor your favorite? Are you allowed to have a favorite?
I don't even have favorites. I think about things in terms of impact and like how quickly I can make that impact happen. SolvCor has immediate impact. I mean, it's happening. It's going to happen. And so, I mean, for the viewers, I mean, just look out for SolvCor inside in a building, or for other things. I mean, it is going to happen, and it's happening. So, in terms of like that's what makes it exciting to me, is how, I mean, you look at clean energy technologies, and as you mentioned, I have multiple inventions at different TRL levels, at very different companies working on them. But in terms of SolvCor, one of the things that makes it unique among, let's say, clean energy technologies is how little capital costs and infrastructure is required to do it, and how seamlessly it integrates within that infrastructure, and the kind of the return on investment profile, both in terms of energy, but also CO2 emissions abatement. And so those are really unique in SolvCor. It makes it really a no-brainer for people to implement, and for these companies to implement. And so it's one of these technologies. It's a very unique thing, and that's what makes it so exciting, and makes me motivated to just say, look, like, let's get this everywhere we can as quickly as possible, because of how quickly this really can have an emissions benefit and an energy efficiency benefit. So I wouldn't say it's a favorite or not. I look at each invention that I develop, and I have a very strong screening process for where I spend my time. I mean, there's only so much time, so I really look at, and that criteria includes some of the things I described, with SolvCor. It's really saying, like, for every unit of effort I put in, how much impact can I achieve with this? And so SolvCor, that math looks really good, and so that's part of what motivates me to work on that.
So I love that you are starting and focusing with impact, right? Like, that is very important to me as well, because there is a challenge and a delicate balance between making money and having impact. And in climate tech, like, those things are starting to come together, which is why it's an exciting time to be doing what you're doing. But I also like that you're leading with that. Have you done the like carbon impact analysis? Do you have anything like that? And do your investors, customers, do you feel like that resonates with them?
Absolutely. It's a very unique situation. There's very little carbon actually required to make SolvCor, and we found that out. The return on carbon investment in a typical chiller process happens within 4 months. And so it's a very quick process. And I think that's the most important metric. But then often when you have a fast return on carbon invested, you also get a fast return on actual investment. Especially when it's something that's energy efficiency related. And that's what we're finding with SolvCor, because ultimately the carbon we're saving is due to the electricity consumed in these processes, and we're saving that electricity. And so it transcends to electricity. And so it depends on the price of the electricity, but you're looking at still less than a year return on investment on the electricity. And so that's a very unusual set of I guess, economic and kind of CO2 emissions abatement characteristics for a technology, which is why SolvCor really can just be dispatched or deployed quite quickly. It's not just, I mean, as you mentioned, it's separating money from, making money versus, helping the environment. Those two things go very hand in hand, especially if a technology doesn't have a green premium. So and that's super important. I mean, we all think, like, sometimes people think like in a Western centric or like an OECD centric like thought process, like Europe and the US. But in terms of the actual amount of emissions that, let's say, the OECD has, it's quite small compared to what ultimately the emerging market economies have for emissions, especially going forward. And this is even more pronounced as countries like India and Indonesia I mean, you can just think of, let's just call it Southeast Asia and more broadly, where most of the human population lives. As they become more wealthy, if you look at the percentage of air conditioning use in these very warm countries, warmer than Houston, even more humid than Houston, it's very small. And they're going to start buying air conditioners. They already are. They're going to start buying cooling. And so not only are most, as of now, most of the emerging market economies responsible for current emissions, most of the world's current emissions, but they'll be even more so going forward. And so it makes it so important to improve the efficiency of cooling in a zero green premium way, because ultimately most of these emerging market economies, most people, as they get more wealthy, they're not so wealthy that they can pay a green premium or that they can just, they can justify paying for it. But ultimately, if there is no green premium or it's more efficient than the alternative, it will be implemented.
And when you talk about the energy transition in Houston, we tend to focus on energy and not energy efficiency.
Yes.
So this is such a missed opportunity. I think if you think about Winter Storm Uri, but if you also think about all of the times on a random Tuesday, anywhere from like April to October, where all of a sudden the market goes crazy and they say, everybody turn off all of your appliances because there's increased demand and reduced supply, that just efficiency and the things that we do all day long can have a huge impact.
Absolutely.
Right?
And actually, one thing that's quite exciting about SolvCor too is it's ultimately, think about it in terms of thermal storage. So people often think about battery storage, right? Electricity storage from batteries. What people forget, especially when you live in a place like Houston, where much of the electricity use is in fact cooling, especially during those times of year that you just described, you ultimately have, why would you want to convert into electricity into chemicals and back into electricity only to then have to use the electricity for cooling? What if you could just stay as cooling? And so thermal storage is really possibly the least expensive and most efficient way of storing energy. And so what SolvCor ultimately does for thermal storage is it makes a cooling system have already inherently more thermal capacity in it. So if ultimately, 2 times more thermal capacity in a building, so that helps. But also for chilled water thermal storage, which is how university campuses and kind of large hospitals and those kind of, let's call them campus-like infrastructure does thermal storage, we're able to almost double the thermal capacity of those thermal storage tanks. And so that's another benefit. We think about when electricity prices are really high, or when we know ahead of time that it's going to be really hot at this point in the day, being able to store the cold from night or store the cooling when electricity is a little bit more plentiful, so that you can use that stored cooling when the electricity is expensive or scarce. That's going to really help also with the electricity grid and being able to manage that in places like Houston.
So we're going to talk more about Houston, but my last question, and I hope this isn't stupid, but what is it like as an entrepreneur and inventor to be working on an experiment and find something that you didn't expect, right? I work in policy a lot, and so it's trying to advocate and teach people about something we already know is real, but I'm trying to convince you. But I don't have any doubt because it's fairly well accepted and adopted, right? But you're finding something that is completely new, defies the laws of science or the laws of what we had thought. What does that feel like?
I actually get really critical very quickly. I don't believe, the number of times in even a day that sometimes I think I've co-discovered something, I just get super critical super quickly. I say, what I'm seeing I have like a whole set of questions. I'm always just kind of breaking it down. And I should say this, I get a jump in energy. Like I want to find these answers out immediately as quickly as possible. I don't like slow down. I just kind of throw everything else aside and like I need to find like whether or not this is like legitimately what I think it is, and this actually, worth my time. And so I'll spend maybe an hour, or I don't keep track of how much time it is. I'm just going to, until I get those answers. And many times I go through this process and I start off like really being very discerning and trying to really figure out the answers to those questions of, is it just believing, or am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Is it really what I think it is? And I can go through all those kind of questions that you ask, but really what it is that, I ultimately, most of the time I do that, I ultimately figure out something. And that goes much further out than, and rarely, or I should say not actually rarely, across the full spectrum, because this happens enough in my life. But in terms of of the percentage of times that I have one of these moments that actually ends up being something that I think is worth pursuing, it's pretty rare. I usually have this enough where I'm almost kind of immune to it. Like it doesn't really, it doesn't create that kind of like, the kind of excitement is more just that kind of energy and motivation to go do this process of really making sure that it's like almost my own due diligence to make sure this is worth pursuing. And the first questions are about viability. Like, is this really what I think it is? Is this viable? And it goes from everything from like, can you actually make this, to like, does this actually do what I think it's doing? And then once I figure that out, the question is, have people done this before? Because I don't want to spend time on things that people have done before.
Yeah.
That's just not exciting to me. And so and in that process, I almost pretend I'm a patent examiner. I pretend I want to find, the thing that will put a nail in the coffin. Because ultimately, if I don't act that way, someone else will, after I've wasted 3 months of time on it. And so it's really important to like be as critical as possible. Like imagine you are like the due diligence person that's like trying to tear it apart. Like you want to be that as quickly as possible when you think you've made a discovery, because it's going to save you so much time in the long term. And also, I can't describe how many times it actually has led me to a better invention or better discovery. Because I'm like, wait, I thought it was this, but then really it was something like what if I just did that to it? That would solve that problem, And ultimately, by the time I actually convey the invention to somebody in the field, it's usually pretty incredible how they're like, you really thought through all this. Like, wow, like you actually understand what I'm doing. And then also sometimes in the process of like being that due diligence person, being as discerning as like really kind of drilling down into all of this, into the viability and economic viability and the differentiation, really drilling into that, I become an expert in an area that I wasn't before, and that's also something that a lot of what I know and learned wasn't necessarily from school. It was really through this process, because you retain so much when you act like this, because it's so important to you. When you have that energy, it just becomes so important to like really understand that, because it's going to build and build and build on ultimately. The other thing too is, because I've had this happen enough times, the things I've learned from those past experiences become really helpful in the next invention that I develop, or often become building blocks to that next invention.
So you make a discovery, then you spend time trying to do everything you can to shoot that discovery down.
Yes.
And over 150 times, it's worked out.
Yes.
Which is exciting. And you can just tell how excited you are like from this question, which is exciting for all of us in Houston. So I want to get to, how did you end up here? You're not from here originally. Tell us your experience, the good, the bad, what you love. I want to see the other things, the ones that might also be your next favorite after SolvCor here. So.
Oh, yeah. I actually, Houston, I feel like I've had a connection with Houston for some time. It's not for example, I grew up in the Northeast, so I'm not from Texas or Houston, but just some time ago, since 2014, my patent attorney has been based in Houston, and I work really closely with him. And so that was instrumental in kind of my recognition that Houston's the place to be for what I do. But also in terms of in 2019, I received the Houston Intellectual Property Association's Inventor of the Year Award. So I was down here for that. But then more recently, most of the people I work with are based in Houston, or work for companies based in Houston, or have large presence in Houston, or the technical competencies are in Houston. And so that was another huge driver for why I moved to Houston. And then more generally, I came to a realization that Houston's really the only city in the United States that has the technical competencies, the infrastructure, and the companies that are required, or I should say required, to do all of my inventions at scale. And it really doesn't exist anywhere else. And so if you want to do things at scale, if you want to have the infrastructure and you want to have the technical competencies to do it, it's hard to find a better place than Houston.
And we've got the Astros.
And you got the Astros.
Yeah.
I know. Last night, my gosh, that was incredible.
So talk more about, I mean, we've got all of the ecosystem, right?
Yes.
Is it what you expected? So you've been here before, but like you're here for other entrepreneurs, for folks who are starting out, for folks who are getting into this space. Talking about energy transition and climate is hard. What's working well?
I think the most important thing and what I value most here are the customers and strategic partnerships, and like just really having access to those relationships. It's the companies. It's there's so much precedence here. I mean, so much precedent. Like it has, and it's not just in like name only. I mean, it really is like it exists here. Like it's the intellectual mecca, intellectual epicenter of all the major engineering and construction and chemicals and it just is here. And so you realize that. I mean, I realize that naturally through the process of just, I mean, going back to like the way I find like how I work with customers. I mean, I just, in terms of who actually knows like what to do or how to do, or even just the person responsible for like a particular component of a system, like you generally find them in Houston or like their bosses in Houston or like, so like it just comes down to here. And so it's really a great place to just get things done because it can get done here. It's not just like, and so that's really important. And then, I mean, I guess more broadly, in just terms of the nature, depending on, I mean, if you're doing clean tech, that's what I just described as super important. But like just more broadly, it's a very business friendly environment. So on top of all the good things about, something that's just intrinsic to Houston, but generally it's a very business friendly environment. It's a very open environment. It's a very diverse environment. And so if you have like crazy ideas or you operate differently than I guess the status quo, it's actually a really good place to be as well. And I don't know if people necessarily know that or don't know that, but it's not conforming in nature is what I think is really also a nice thing about Houston. I mean, you can really be who you want to be, even politically too. I mean, I'm pretty moderate politically, but it's just interesting how you can see all sorts of, I mean, you see everything here in Houston in terms of that. And so it's a very accepting place. And it's not, you can be different, not just in name only, but also like people, it's almost like, I feel like in the innovation, it's almost expected, like there's something different. You have to be different, but I don't say you have to be different. Again, it's accepting of everything, but if you are different, it's not a bad thing here.
You literally said all of the good things that I can possibly think of. So I don't know what else to ask you about Houston. Someone told me the other day, and I love this, that there are no red or blue electrons and there are no red or blue molecules.
Yes.
Right. And that in the energy space, like say what you want about Texas politics, that it truly is a pretty like neutral, people come together to talk about making things work. And they don't really care where you're from, like your backstory, you're from all over the world, and that's just like accepted and normal. And I love that about Houston. And it is so special. And it's also something you kind of only see and get if you're here.
Yeah.
We don't have billboards in other parts of the world that's like, oh, Houston. Maybe we should. I don't know about that.
Remember, Houston, it's hot.
Yeah,
that's the billboard.
Our marketing is still in the works, right?
Well, I mean, I think something that's kind of interesting. It's Houston is hot, but man, the wintertime isn't that bad. I mean, there is the times of year.
Houston, it's not cold.
It's not. It's kind of nice. You always have like in terms of like every week you have all 4 seasons during the wintertime here, which is kind of neat. So you always like if it's cold one day and you don't want it to be cold, you're like okay, in a few days it'll be warm. You don't really have to like. It's a nice feeling coming from the Northeast where and that's not why I moved down here, of course. I mean, if I was really just looking for warm weather, there's plenty of other places you could go. But in terms of just weather, I think it gets a bad reputation, but it's not really as bad as people like make it out to be. By the way, air conditioning works very well in Houston. My apartment back in Princeton, they never fixed the air conditioner. So I had a number of nights that were way too hot in the summertime and had trouble sleeping. Never had that issue in Houston. So even if it's very hot outside, you can be quite cold inside. It's almost recommended to bring a sweatshirt with you in the summertime.
That is the suggested attire.
Yes.
That reminds me when I was doing Clean Tech Open back in like 2012 in Boston, there was one startup going around renting out window unit air conditioners for the 3 weeks a year you need it in Boston.
Yes.
And you would do an annual subscription so you could have it show up, and they would run distribution in like June and July just so you could have it for that 1 or 2 weeks where you would die.
It's funny you mentioned that because I think that 3 weeks is getting longer.
Yeah, it's
there.
true.
Yeah, because my dad grew up in the Massachusetts area, and they used to not need any air conditioning, but like 10 years ago they had to install air conditioning. My grandma had to install the air conditioning. So clearly it is getting warmer up there. So
this is a huge equity issue also.
Yes.
Your story. That a lot, there are people in every community, but definitely in the South where it is hot in the summer, where your bills get too high and they choose between like food and just like daily cost of living and air conditioning.
Right.
And so when we, the many things we have to consider when we think about energy, technology, and climate and how all of these come together, if you can just make the air conditioning, if you can make the technology that you have in your home already better, less expensive, like that's a pretty big win. So
it is.
That is exciting.
Thank you.
Communities everywhere.
Yeah, and when you think about where we're going as a country, like we talk about climate affecting us nationally, what do you think the goals of our industry or your industry should be for 2050, other than having SolvCor in every cooling system?
Oh yeah, other than that, yeah, definitely very important. So in terms of the cooling industry, there are opportunity. I mean, I always like going down to physics and saying, okay, like what is the minimum amount of energy you need to do this? Like to do whatever that is. In the case cooling or heating, we're still pretty far off from that across the whole industry. And so the goal by 2050, I like doing shorter term goals, but when you go really far out, people underappreciate what you can do past 10 years. So I would say, what is the physics level minimum energy required to do, cooling? And I would make the target as close as possible to that, and say that's what we should be achieving across on kind of an average across industry, across different domains, especially where they can afford to do that. Clearly, tech companies that have data centers and large industrial companies can, in theory, right now afford to be more efficient. So. And they're always trying to be. I'm not saying like that they obviously are motivated to do that too. But that's I think the starting point. I mean, the best energy, the cleanest energy is the energy you don't use. And so if you can, if that should be the first goal, more important than the CO2 emissions goal, in my view. I mean, a lot of times the CO2 emissions goal can be a game. I mean, they use offsets, they do, and the quality of those offsets are questionable, and it can be just big financial modeling exercise. It doesn't really have any impact on the world. When you start looking at the actual energy use of a building, or the actual source of that energy, that's a lot more real, especially from a climate impact or just impact in general.
We spend a lot of time trying to develop technology that gives us an excuse to use more and do more when we could instead use less, right?
Yes. Although I do have the view that we want to be able to, we don't want to make people sacrifice. And so it would be great if you could live like you had, or like the world could live like they had more, or they actually had more, but ultimately we're using less. I mean,
that's where efficiency comes in.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Like the whole do more with less. We don't want to be in making people have to choose from one or the other.
Because they won't.
Right.
If they don't have to.
Right.
And I guess in Europe, they're kind of being forced right now to make that decision, but I don't think that's a good thing. It's not actually helping climate change. It's causing them to start coal-fired power plants. So, I mean, clearly that's not how we want people to operate. We want, that's why energy efficiency is so important.
It's funny you're saying this now. This reminds me of a conversation I had with a venture capitalist from Boston, Matthew Norton. He had this great presentation on this thing called Jevons paradox, and his example, I think, back in the day was about lighting, and he brought out this example where you think of early lighting. It used to be candles, and so literally people would have a certain amount that they would spend on lighting, but it didn't mean they had candles everywhere because it was just too expensive. It was too painful. And then you switch to incandescent light bulbs. And then guess what? People started using lighting more. It was cheaper than a candle. It was like it wasn't as much of a consumable. It didn't have as many extraneous factors. And as we made the transition to LEDs, guess what happened? People kept the lights on, right?
Yes.
Because it was so cheap. You would go from a 100-watt light bulb down to a 7-watt light bulb. And now it became an afterthought. It's kind of like how we think about other utilities like electricity and water. Let's just leave it on. It's so cheap. And that is the double-edged sword of efficiency is it makes it easy to consume. And that's not necessarily the best thing for limited resources.
Well, the good thing about it is, and this is where, I mean, I think it's an unfortunate thing that a lot of people like associate solving climate change with making things more expensive or causing people to sacrifice more. Ultimately, if we're going to solve it, that's not how we're going to solve it. Is this, at least that's my point of view, especially considering the fact that most of the emerging market economies are responsible for the future emissions, not the previous, but the future emissions. And so ultimately, to get that kind of adoption, it can't be like that. And so with that understanding, it's really important to say, well, yeah, okay, LEDs enabled a whole new paradigm in terms of how we view electricity use from lighting. Now, it used to be that you want to let the natural light into your buildings. If you talk to skyscraper developers, they're like, oh, we want the natural light into the buildings. That was historically the way they viewed it. Now it's for aesthetic reasons. If they wanted to be energy efficient, because LEDs are so efficient, you're better off building like a giant concrete building with no windows. Clearly, we don't want that. But like that's exactly because of just how efficient LED light bulbs are. And so from that perspective, it's such a great opportunity to really make the planet operate at a higher standard of living as a whole, like raise people's standard of living while living in harmony with the planet. And that's really what I see as the opportunity in climate change, or I shouldn't say climate change, but just this energy transition at large. First of all, the energy transition term, I'm not sure it's really a great term, but if we were to use that term, it's not a transition of like one type of fuel to another type of fuel. It's hopefully a transition from essentially what was kind of, let's say, less sustainable to what's more sustainable, but more importantly, hopefully a transition where we can go and raise the standard of living of the average person in the world without destroying our planet, while living in harmony with our planet. And ultimately, I mean, if we want, like back to your point, if we can make electricity cheaper, if we can make it more abundant, we can make it more affordable, if we can make the ultimate end uses of that electricity, the users of that electricity more efficient, then, I mean, there's a whole new realm of possibilities that now become available to you. I mean, in terms of like a lot of the stuff involving decarbonization involves how much energy is consumed in that decarbonization. If you could source that from electricity, you would, but unfortunately, electricity is just too expensive relative to other forms of heat. I mean, other sources of heat. And so there's such an opportunity. If we can lower the cost of energy, you can increase the reliability of energy or increase energy efficiency. The world is your oyster in terms of possibilities.
Yeah.
I like it. So thinking about the people who are listening right now, what can they do to help you? Is there anything? Do you have any asks?
I think one of the things we talked about before for you was that there are a lot of applications, right?
There are.
It's about finding that expert who knows the most about implementation, can have impact. Is there an industry where you're thinking about where you haven't quite found that right expert yet?
Not as much that. I do think there's an opportunity though. I mean, look, SolvCor is really a platform. It's a really new, it opens up a whole new set of possibilities, right? And so with that, there likely will be a lot of innovation built on top of that. So like things that are enabled that previously weren't possible. And I'm excited to see where that leads to. So there may be somebody who's listening who says, wow, if I could do that, if I could have double the heat capacity, I would want to do this. And maybe that's something I have or haven't thought of, but in any case, it's exciting because it's meaning we're improving the world somehow. So if we can, that's one takeaway. The other is, I mean, back to the point, I mean, if they have some ideas of how to if there's a building that they think they should have SolvCor in, if there's a, something that they have access to or they can see an opportunity for, I may or may not be aware of it. So, I mean, that's also a way they can be helpful.
How would they find you?
I mean, my LinkedIn, you can definitely message me on LinkedIn or link in with me. So that's probably the best way of reaching out to me.
Cool. Is there any last thoughts or wisdom you would want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, definitely the most. I mean, it goes back to that point of sacrifice. I mean, we shouldn't view climate change and solving climate change as a sacrifice, because that's just not, it's just not in our natural. We always are improving as a society. We always want to be improving. People get excited about improvement. I don't think people get excited about sacrifice. But also, more importantly, that's just how our economy and our society functions. And that's how everything historically happened. I mean, every major improvement in society that has happened pretty much has been due to some technology or some set of technologies. I shouldn't say, at least as it relates to energy and water and the things we need. I mean, of course, there's public policy and other things, but in terms of like the essentials, like what people actually need to live, it's usually a technology that kind of drives that. And so, or I should say, a set of technologies, right? And so, when we look at the future, I'm very optimistic about the future. Especially, I see a very exciting opportunity for our planet to live, for humans to live in harmony with the planet and get all the things they need. And that's the vision that we should all be working toward.
Yeah. That's perfect. So we are excited that you are in Houston. You're an incredible resource. I am excited to see all of the patents and new patents that are coming. And there are lots of entrepreneurs who I bet could learn so much from you. So be prepared for an onslaught of people reaching out saying, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah.
Thank you.